Hi, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to Climate Solutions webinar briefing on climate action in the Washington legislative session in 2019. I'm going to, without any more time, hand it over to Vlad Gutman-Britton, who is our Washington State Director for Climate Solutions. And I think, as folks know, Climate Solutions is a clean energy economy nonprofit working to accelerate clean energy solutions to the climate crisis. And we work in the Northwest to accelerate solutions also beyond our borders to solve the climate crisis in time. So I'd like to turn it over to Vlad, who's been leading the charge in session. Take it away.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. A whole bunch of people on already, more people coming, still dialing in. So that's really exciting about the energy and how ready everyone is to kind of jump into the session that we're going to have, an urgent one for taking action, ambitious and effective action to combat climate change and accelerate clean energy solutions. We got a pretty dense presentation here for you all to make sure that people are comfortable and up to speed on what we're likely to see this session. It's not a comprehensive look at every policy that we're going to expect this session, but it's some of the major ones that Climate Solutions and many of our partners are looking at. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to do here on the phone, we're going to go through a little bit of the lay of the land from an emissions perspective, where Washington is and where it needs to go. We'll go through three major climate policies. We'll talk about some of the latest research that Climate Solutions and some of our partners commissioned on polling and the attitudes of the public and their readiness to take action. And then we'll leave some time for questions at the end, hopefully. Anyway, so again, appreciate everyone joining us, and I'm going to jump in here. I'm just going to jump right in. Okay, so again, just to start, where are we in Washington in terms of our kind of climate and emissions picture? Let's see here. Is this going to work? Yes. So that blue bar on the left is 1990 emissions in Washington. It's 88.4 million tons. 2013, the orange bar, is the most recent greenhouse gas inventory that Washington has completed. We should have a new one here in the next couple of weeks. We're up 7% over our 1990 levels. We're going the wrong way. And if we adopt the levels and achieve the goals that the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group has laid out, which is 80% reductions below 1990 levels, we have to get to that gray bar there at the end, an 82% reduction from where we were in 2013, a pretty significant transformation of our economy and a doable but urgent transition to clean energy. So if we do nothing, if we kind of continue along the kind of current policy pathway that we have right now, we do expect some emission reductions. We expect coal to leave our grid and be replaced with natural gas and some renewables. We expect more efficient gasoline engines and some electric cars and trucks and things like that. But the real point of this slide is to show that our current policy environment, our current trajectory, it's going to fall short. We need more policy. We need more partnership between the public sector and the private sector, between civil society and individuals to get this job done. If we stay on the path we are now, we will exceed the emissions that we can continue. The emissions allowance that we have for 2050 by 50 million tons. And worth remembering, of course, that so much of the research that we've seen recently shows that even this goal may not be enough. But even this goal, we're going to blow past by 5 times if we don't start taking immediate action right away. The good news is that we can achieve this transition. The job can be done. And this is one pathway that the State of Washington Commission that shows what it would be like to achieve that level of reductions. We need to largely eliminate fossil fuels from our electricity system. All the single occupancy vehicles on the road have to be electric, and many of the medium and heavy duty trucks need to be electrified to transition to zero emission sources as well. We need to electrify and deploy zero emission vehicles to replace the use of diesel and some biofuels mixes for sustainable biofuels for kind of the long haul and the more difficult to electrify use cases. And we significantly need to reduce our use of fossil gas to heat our homes and heat our water and in industry as well. The good news about this pathway, again, the state's pathway from the Deep Decarbonization Pathway Study, is that this particular pathway found that if we achieve this transition, not only will we have done a significant portion of our contribution to cutting global warming pollutants, we'll also reduce how much we spend on energy how much households spend on energy in Washington. This pathway showed a $7 reduction of monthly energy spending by Washington households. Other scenarios in this study showed savings as high as $96 per month. So yes, we should do this to preserve a livable Earth for ourselves and our children and future generations. We should do this because we will support economic vitality and a clean energy revolution that will support economic growth and jobs in this state. And we should do it because we're going to be keeping more of our hard-earned energy dollars in our pocket instead of sending it to other parts of the continent and globe for fossil fuels extracted elsewhere. So all of this is to say that this clean energy transition is possible. It's beneficial across many different ways, and the package this year won't make sure we get all the way, but it's going to start us on an ambitious pathway to get the job done and get it going. So I'm gonna pass it over. Oh, excuse me, sorry. So the package this year at a high level includes 3 major policies that we're going to go through. 100% clean electricity policy, a clean fuel standard that will start phasing us off of fossil fuels and oil in the transportation sector, and a clean buildings proposal that'll make sure that our energy hogging buildings hog maybe just a lot less energy over time, reducing our emissions associated again with heating our homes and heating our water. There will be other proposals in the legislature that are important, but we won't go through on this call. EV incentives, a zero-emission vehicle mandate is being proposed, a ban on super pollutants called hydrofluorocarbons that are very potent. So lots of things going on. We're going to go through those 3 bolded policies there at the top as some of the major priorities for this session. So I'm going to pass it over to Kelly Hall, our Washington Policy Manager, to talk through the first priority, and then we'll keep going from there.
Thanks, Vlad. And yes, as Vlad mentioned, my name is Kelly Hall. I'm the Washington Policy Manager, and I'm going to start with that first policy, the 100% clean electricity. You know, Vlad just showed you basically the trajectory that we need to be on in order to get to 80% reductions by 2050. And as he started to go into detail on, you know, the grid is really the foundation of that change. As we electrify lots of sources, you know, like the transportation sector, direct use natural gas, we really need to make sure that we have a clean grid as that foundation for change. So, you know, we get the question all the time from utilities, why are you picking on us? Why, you know, the grid is already pretty clean, so shouldn't you be focusing on all of these other sectors? And, you know, that is true. We are relatively clean here in Washington compared to the rest of the country, but as Vlad was just showing you in those trajectories, as we electrify as much as we can, we could see basically a doubling of the share of energy coming from electricity. So research consistently shows there have been multiple studies. This graph that you're looking at now is from a Washington State study that shows basically over the next 3 decades, we need to nearly fully decarbonize the grid. You can see down at the bottom, that black and brown bars, those are coal and gas, and you can see that we will, with this trajectory, remove coal by the mid-2020s and gradually phase out natural gas over time until it's over 98% carbon-free. Getting there, the policy, we talk about, you know, getting to 100% clean electricity, and here's the policy that will get us there. You can see that in 2025, we'll see a full coal phase out. Then by 2030, we'll start phasing in more renewable energy to replace that coal and ensure that we are on that pathway to 100% clean. So the benchmark in 2030 basically requires 100% carbon neutral power. And what that means is that utilities have a little bit of flexibility in how they comply. There's a minimum of 80% of your energy will actually be supplied with clean electricity. And then utilities can make other investments in transportation, electrification, energy efficiency, you know, other projects that we support in order to get to that carbon neutral power and mitigate their other emissions. You can see then in 2040, there's another incremental step down. That flexibility decreases over time, again, to ensure that we have early action and that utilities are on that pathway to 100% clean. And then by 2045, you can be certain that your energy, all the energy delivered to you and to the state will be 100% clean electricity. This is Governor Inslee. Governor Inslee is requesting this legislation, and we're likely to have two of the same bill, one in the House and one in the Senate. In the House, it'll be sponsored by Representative Gail Tarleton, and in the Senate, we have Senator Kevin Rinker. So another question we get from utilities is, is this actually possible? Nobody has studied this. Can we do this in an affordable and, feasible way and ensure that our lights are still on? And the answer to this is yes. Climate Solutions did research this past year with a consulting firm that the utilities themselves often hire to do their analysis, and found that achieving 100% clean as renewable energy costs decline, we actually can get to 100% clean by 2045 in a very cost-effective way that also maintains a reliable grid. So you can see here these new resource builds on the left. We will have large investments in wind and solar and storage. This model projects 28 gigawatts of renewable energy and 7 gigawatts of storage in order to achieve that, that reliable grid. This is only assuming today's technologies. So even with today's technologies, we can achieve this, and the incremental projected cost is only 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Any model that you try to project out over the next 30 years is likely to be pretty conservative, because technological change happens much, much faster than models can predict. So while this model predicts about 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour, we actually think that it will be a lot less than that, and that it actually could be cheaper than a future that relied on fossil fuels. So that's the vision for 100% clean energy. I'm going to turn it back to Vlad now to talk about clean buildings, which is another part of achieving a clean electricity system.
So, these two policies, as well as the next one, all fit together pretty well. Our buildings is where we use much of our electricity, and so in order to make it possible and easier and feasible to fully phase out our reliance on fossil fuels and greenhouse gas pollution in the electricity sector, it's going to go a long way to making sure that not only that the amount of energy we're using is declining, is shrinking, and is coming down over time. And that's why a clean buildings proposal intended to make sure that our buildings, that we heat our homes, and we for those of us that air condition our homes and heat our water, that we do that in the least energy intensive way and the cleanest possible way, is a really important part of making sure we end fossil fuels. If we continue using energy in the ways that we are today, if we increase our use per square foot and things like that, it's only going to get that much harder to end our reliance on fossil fuels. So these pieces fit together very closely and are very important to each other. So our building sector is responsible for 27% of Washington's emissions. As a sector, unlike certain other ones, we're actually gradually using more energy in our buildings over time. And that's a trajectory that's obviously going the wrong way. We need to maximize our energy efficiency. We've seen significant gains and avoided a lot of growth that we could have had, but we need to not just avoid that growth, we need to reverse it. We need to reduce our energy use, and we need to cut the emissions associated with being inside. The Washington legislature has previously adopted a goal of reducing building energy use by 70% by 2030, and this policy is intended to help achieve that outcome. So it'll do that in a number of ways, but we're going to just highlight three of the kind of major buckets. One is looking at our existing building stock. Buildings like power plants and factories and things like that don't turn over very quickly. You might buy a car today and replace it in 11 to 12 years, but once a building's been built, especially the large commercial ones, they're going to be around for a very long time. And so making sure that we look at those buildings that we have now and address their emissions is an important part of getting this goal done. And so this package will propose a new building performance standard, a nation-leading building performance standard for existing commercial buildings, and create an incentive program to help spur early action. It'll require existing commercial buildings to achieve deep energy reductions by 2026 and in the years that follow. And again, provide an incentive that supports and will address some of the barriers to entry in making these investments for those building owners, for those renters and tenants that are willing to act quickly and soon. It'll also require natural gas utilities to set conservation targets and undertake programs to achieve them. We know we have to reverse the direction, the increasing use of fossil gas and for heating and building energy use. And so this will expand our leading electricity conservation programs to our natural gas utilities as well. We also want to make sure that when we build new buildings, that those buildings are as efficient and as high-tech as we possibly can make them. So the bill will direct the state to create a new aspirational building code that will become law will become law in 2030, and provide a roadmap for builders and architects and folks that work in the sector to know what the requirements are coming down the pipe. At the same time, it's going to let cities and counties adopt those standards early. What we see right now is Kelly and I and many folks on the climate solutions team, we talk to local governments and they say, we want to do more, we want cleaner buildings, but the state just doesn't give us the authority to do that. And so this is an important component to address that. We want to create an ambitious new standard for deep energy efficiency in new buildings beginning in 2030 for the entire state, and allow places across the state to adopt those requirements early. And then the final piece there is a significant package of investments in renewal in public buildings and private sector buildings to renew our existing building stock and spur innovation. That includes investments to support net zero schools and public buildings, and a variety of other kind of investments like that will support cleaning up the existing buildings we have now, reducing the state's energy spending through its general fund budget, meaning we have more money for other important services and supporting the safety net and other kind of tasks and goals of the state government. So we spend more on that and less on buildings. And what's important in all this is like all of these programs, but this is a major job creator. We're talking about investments in new construction that support energy efficiency jobs. It would require investments in the existing buildings, which have some work and support obviously jobs today. But if we're going to spur innovation and spur retrofits in existing buildings, that's going to really drive investment and job creation for our friends in organized labor and elsewhere to really support those kind of upgrades that are necessary. So we think, like many of these policies, that this is really marrying the clean energy drive that we need with the job creation that's going to make it possible. I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly for the Clean Fuel Standard.
All right, this is the last big policy that we'll talk about. You know, we've talked about electricity, we've talked about buildings, but obviously transportation is also a major part, a component of our greenhouse gas emissions in Washington state. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a clean fuel standard. This is a policy that we basically have all up and down the West Coast except for in Washington. So there are similar versions of this policy in California, Oregon, and British Columbia, and Washington is kind of the missing link here. So basically what this policy does is requires a reduction in the carbon intensity of fuels in Washington state. It's kind of like a renewable portfolio standard for those of you who are familiar with RPSs in the electricity sector. It's similar to that policy, but for transportation fuels. And just want to note that when I say carbon intensity of the fuels, that is the carbon intensity over the entire life cycle of the fuel. So we're not just talking about the tailpipe emissions, but that calculation really does consider the full life cycle emissions of the fuels. So basically, as you look at this trajectory, this graph here on the screen, fuels that have a higher carbon intensity than the orange line here will be in deficit and create deficits. And fuels that are cleaner, that are below that line with a lower carbon intensity, will create credits. The important thing here is that the oil industry, fuels like gasoline and diesel will fall above that line, and they must match any deficits with credits that are generated by cleaner fuels, electricity, other types of investments like that. So these are a couple of different ways how entities can comply. All of these are types of investments that we would expect to be in a clean transportation future. So refineries could improve the efficiency of their operations in order to reduce emissions. So making a more efficient process so that we don't have as many emissions during that refining process. They can also blend a cleaner biofuel into their product. So, using a mixed product that will clean up the oil industry's carbon intensity of those fuels. And then another way is they can purchase credits from the producers of a clean fuels that would be equivalent to their deficit. So someone who is producing renewable natural gas or a utility, electricity used as a fuel, you can actually purchase credits from those entities that are creating the fuels. So why is this good? Obviously this has a lot of emissions certainty. There is a trajectory, and we are guaranteed a certain level of emissions reduction and a reduction in carbon intensity of those fuels. Another really important co-benefit of this policy is that it does a lot to reduce local air pollution. So transportation is responsible for a lot of the harmful air pollution in our state, and this policy has the dual benefit of reducing those emissions in our local communities. It also creates a demand for these low carbon biofuels and for electrification. So, in the transportation sector and all sectors, we're going to need market transformations, and we're going to need the demand for these fuels in order to ensure that they are cost effective. And so this type of policy really does help to create the demand for those low carbon fuels. And they do that by creating a new revenue stream. So low carbon fuel producers, like I said, they can sell their the credits that they generate to the oil industry, which then creates that revenue stream that helps make the fuel more cost effective. This graph is really just to show you that this program is working. This is a graph from California that shows where credits are coming from, and as you can see over time, you can see an increased diversity of where we're getting low carbon fuels. You can see, especially in some of the later years, due to some policy changes, we are really starting to incentivize electrification and seeing more of that market spurred by this policy. There are a variety of fuels that are used, and that is part of the design of this policy, that it is flexible on which fuels are used for compliance, but does a good job to start to spur a diversity of fuels that will help us achieve a low carbon transportation sector. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Vlad, and he is going to tell you why we're all ready.
So Climate Solutions, Nature Conservancy, Washington Environmental Council, Washington Conservation Voters, and Audubon Washington worked together to put a poll in the field last month to sort of evaluate where is the public? Are folks ready for the clean energy transition? Is it just a few segments of folks that are calling for this, but it's not on the radar broadly? And the good news is that we were very happy with the results that indicated wide support for action on climate. So in November of this year, last month, we put a poll in the field that asked 1,200 voters, 2018 voters, I should specify, a series of questions about climate policy, about recent initiatives, and about some of the policies that we just discussed. So you'll see here are some of the technical pieces here. The poll was done via landline and on cell phones, as well as some online sampling. We have, for the larger samples, we have margin of error of less than 3%, and for the smaller samples, less than 5%. So we have a pretty robust result here that we have confidence reflects the standing and positions of the public. So one of the questions we asked, we wanted to find out, do Washingtonians, do 2018 voters, I should say, believe that climate change is happening? 80% of respondents said that they do believe it's happening, and it's interesting because when this question is asked nationally, most recently in March of this year, 70% of the American public believe that climate change is real. So Washington exceeds the national average by a pretty substantial margin, by 10 points. And to go down a level deeper, what we see is consistent and steady growth over the years in the number of people that believe that they're extremely sure that it's happening. So while the number of people saying in Washington that they believe it's happening has held steady in the low 80s, the number of people that say that they're extremely sure it's happening has gone from 41% in 2015 to nearly half, 49% last month. So Washington voters are also much more engaged on this issue. So not only do they believe it's happening, but they're also paying attention and talking about it. So nationally, again, in March 2018, when Yale asked American adults, do you believe that, do you speak about climate change at home with friends and family? About 35%, about a third of the American public said that they do discuss climate often or occasionally. In Washington, that number is nearly double. 64% of people said that they speak on a regular, either occasionally or very often about climate change, which means not only do we have a public and a voting population that believes that the science is real, which it's sad that we need to ask, of course, but the numbers are high in Washington, but we also have a public that is engaged, worried, considering, and paying attention to this range of issues. And that's really quite encouraging. Again, more than nearly double the share of the population here talks occasionally or often about climate change, which is a significant result. And then we asked about two of the policies that we just discussed. We talked about, we talked about support for 100% clean energy and clean fuel standard. And as you can see, we wanted to sort of compared it to where the initiative landed. We saw that there's significant support for taking this action. You know, with Initiative 1631 and obviously a disappointing outcome there, that we can attribute that to the very significant investment that we saw by the oil industry, $32 million, an unprecedented amount of spending from out-of-state and out-of-country oil companies to confuse and mislead the public. And the good news is that while we're disappointed certainly in the outcome and the result there, that outcome and that uncertainty that we saw among the public with the initiative did not translate to climate action more broadly. So, for example, while the initiative received 44% statewide support for 100% clean energy by 2045, and the interim pieces that Kelly just described for us, that support was 65%. 47% strongly supported, which is a very high outcome, and 2/3 of the public thinks we need to be adopting this standard. The clean fuel standard that Kelly also described received majority support. 54% of the public says we're ready to undertake this and want to see it go forward. We also asked the public, what were the issues with 1631? I mean, do you support climate action? Do you support climate action but think something different was necessary? Do you just not support climate action at all? And so we really focus on that middle group of people, the group of people who think we need to take action on climate, but for whatever reason were misled by the oil industry and thought that 1631 wasn't the way to go. 71% of that audience, of the folks that decided that 1631 wasn't for them, but we needed something, 71% of that audience wants 100% clean energy to become law. Half of that audience supports the clean fuel standard as well. So what you see here is that, again, while we're disappointed and frustrated with the oil industry for their behavior and the way they conducted themselves during the campaign, those misleading stories, the half-truths that they spent $32 million propping up did not change the public's mind on whether or not we need to act on climate. And I think the last kind of polling piece that I wanted to show you is actually not from Climate Solutions. The Edison Electric Institute, which is a big industry group of investor-owned utilities. Every single investor-owned utility in the country is a member of Edison, including the 3 investor-owned utilities in Washington that serve about half of our Washington customers. they themselves decided that they were surprised by the global push, the national push for 100% clean. And so they decided to see whether or not the polling that we've been sharing, including the one I just shared with you, if it's accurate. And interestingly to us, if anything, our polling isn't accurate in that it underestimates the support for climate action for 100% clean energy. When they, before they, went into messaging and explained all the ways they think the sky would fall, they had 87% of American adults saying 100% clean, 100% renewable energy was the direction we need to go. And even when they said that it will increase bills by 30%, which as Kelly talked about, our research shows that it will not, even after they made that claim, more than half of American adults still want this policy to pass. And that's really, really compelling. When they then provided some of our arguments, some of the pro arguments, the more balanced view about the possibilities for 100% clean, that support went back up to 82%. 8 in 10, 4 out of 5 voters, 4 out of 5 American adults are ready for this country to take action on 100% clean, to phase out fossil fuels in the electricity sector. And again, this is utility polling that even exceeds and is stronger than what we've seen. And so these 3 policies, along with some of the other ones that will be in the legislative session this year, each one of these is passable. Each one of these is doable. And so we're hoping that we can lean on you to help us get the job done. So I'll turn it to Joelle from our team here to talk a little bit about what you can do.
All good. Hi, everyone. It's Joelle Robinson, Field Director at Climate Solutions. And I just want to add a few things to what Vlad and Kelly have shared, which is looking at the RSVP list. I believe that you are so many of the reasons that people are talking about climate more and are willing to engage. And I just have my deepest heartfelt thanks to all of you, because I am blessed to know many of you in your leadership roles, and I'm just so grateful. So, we all did so much together this election, this past election, and of course now is the time for us to show that indeed the people were not defeated, not even close, and that together we can accomplish great things, rolling up our collective sleeves to show that Washington must and will lead in 2019. And I have a few things here, so if everyone can write that phone number down for the hotline, or many of you probably have all 3 of your legislators in your cell phone, but if not, that's an easy way to leave messages. I'm also going to email you all of this, myself and or Audubon, whatever venue you got this, I will email this out to you, but if you could write that down now and we could hit the offices right after this call, that would be really awesome to have a big storm of calls. What? Yeah, sorry. So it's 800-562-6000, because I'm being reminded that not everyone has access to the slides. Thank you. So to then also please leave a message for your legislators, of course, telling them that you are a constituent, and asking them to make climate a top priority issue, and to do everything in their power to pass these 3 bills and more. But specifically, you can specify the 100% clean bill, the clean fuel standard, and the clean buildings bills. And then one other great thing that we can do is we can tweet out, and you can do that right away as well. And that hashtag is WALEDGenow. No, sorry, it's just WALEDG.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So hashtag WALEDG, and ask the legislature to pass the 100% clean, the clean fuel standard, and the clean buildings bill again. All of this is on the Climate Solutions Twitter page. It's also on our Facebook page. We are amplifying a lot of that today. So again, if you can actually take time to do it today, it's a great day to honor the 3rd anniversary of the Paris Agreement. Regardless of what is happening with the president and his reckless decisions on that, I feel like this is one way for us to say that we are absolutely committed to the rest of the world and to our children's future. You can also write a letter to the editor, and I think it's extra powerful to drop in the names of your legislators, thanking, asking, depending on where they are on climate, thanking them or asking them to lead on climate, and again, listing out the bills. So I feel like the more specific we are, certainly their offices are paying attention when their names are mentioned, and they're also paying attention when climate is mentioned and when it's said, this is a top voting issue for me. We'd love for you to save the date for Lobby Day. This is not just on all the clean energy bills, but it will definitely be on all 4 of the environmental communities priorities. So plastics, orca recovery, oil spills, and then 100% legislation. So we are going to have a really powerful gathering that day, and would, really love for us to have a very strong contingency for climate action that day. I think that is it for now, just in the spirit of time. Again, I will put all of this in an email to you, and you'll either get a follow-up from Climate Solutions or Audubon, whoever you RSVP'd through. And I just want to, again, just express my heartfelt thanks, because I know so many of you have been doing this for so long, and you are the reason that I continue to do this work and that I am inspired. And I want to leave you with a quote by Arundhati Roy that I think captures the spirit of what you're doing. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you. Turn it back over to my peers.
Thank you so much, Joelle. So we have some time left for questions. We've gotten a few already that I'll kind of walk through a little bit, and then I turn it over to Kimberly for additional ones. That's on.
Yeah, I wanted to encourage folks. I think right now we are at a place, there are a lot of great questions already entered into the Q&A functionality of the webinar, as well as been chatted in. So we're going to start with those and see if we can get to all of those, and recognize we might not have time for all of it, but we are going to try to quickly cook through. And I think what we'll do is take these in order of the presentation. So first, the questions that were around 100% clean electricity, then we can address some of the ones that came in on clean buildings and then clean fuels. And so recognize that some of those are mostly in order in the chat here as we're going through the presentation. So we'll first address those. Do you want me to tee up the questions, or do you all just want to?
Go ahead.
So the first question that came in, one of them is just this is on 100% clean electricity, why is hydro projected to decline?
Thank you, that's a great question. So that's a great question. The chart that refers to kind of showed a lessening wedge for hydro, and it's not projected to decline. That chart was on a fixed 100% scale. So what that shows is that we will build out more solar and wind. We anticipate the amount of hydro in both, the amount of hydro that we use to stay steady. But as our loads grow as a result of electrifying our transportation system, converting more natural gas uses, fossil gas uses to electricity, the loads will grow, we will build new resources, and so hydro will be a declining share, but still a foundation piece for our electricity system.
Next question that we got is, you had talked about phasing out coal in the early 2020s, 2025 is what you had highlighted, and then there's a phase in of clean power by 2030. So can you just talk about what happens in those 5 years? That coal phase out, clean energy phase in.
Yeah, I mean, what we can anticipate happening is that as utilities close their coal, that they will be able to, they will need to replace much of that. And that means early action today, soon in the coming years, to build out new clean renewables like solar and wind, significant investments in energy efficiency, and other similar solutions. What we've seen very consistently from regional plans, electricity plans for the Northwest region, it shows that we can achieve most of our current load growth that's projected, most of our current increases in demand by deeper and further investments in energy efficiency. The Clean Buildings Bill will contribute to that and put that into overdrive, and so putting those pieces together is really important. So what we would expect to happen in those 5 years and ahead of those 5 years is that utilities will look at the resource needs they have as a result of coal closure, make increased investments in energy efficiency, increased investments in storage, increased investments in wind and in solar power.
Another question that's come in, I'm going to combine two because I think they're on the same subject. So folks should know there's a question around gas. We actually call it like gas-fired power or fracked gas and not natural gas. So you might see in our language and Climate Solutions and a lot of other partners, we're really moving away from using the word natural when it comes to something that's fracked. and taken out of the ground with a lot of chemicals and and polluting processes, and then also further pollute our climate. So there are questions around natural gas, but just note in our answers in language, you'll hear more about gas-fired power or fracked gas, just as a little bit of context. But a question came in as far as folks saw a lot about natural or gas-fired power in our electricity system. So what's the plan for ensuring that it's capped and reduced over time?
So the 100% of clean electricity piece achieves that. What it requires is the utility to achieve certain penetrations of clean and renewable resources. Kelly talked about the coal phase out by 2025 and the steps down in 2030 and in 2040, eventually landing on 100% clean in 2045. So utilities under the bill would need to ensure that they're achieving those benchmarks, those goals, and that means reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, again, ending coal use by 2025, and gradually and effectively reducing their use and reliance on fossil fuels like fracked gas in the intervening period. So the bill itself provides that cap, that emissions reduction certainty, that guarantee that we will achieve pollution reductions to the scale that we need.
Great, thank you. We had another question of, there's obviously, a lot in the news that we saw as far as orcas and health, and people are really concerned about the need for dam removal, river restoration, for a whole host of things, including that iconic species. That's just context, not into the question, but I think it's why it's coming up for a lot of folks. So what's the plan to balance the hydro in the mix with the need for dam removal, restoration, river restoration?
So the fate of the lower Snake River dams is not affected by this proposal, and nor should this proposal have any impact on decisions involving those dams. Our partners at the Northwest Energy Coalition recently commissioned a study looking at what would it take, what would happen if the federal government made a decision about the future of those dams. And what they found is that energy, should that come to pass, that energy can and should be replaced with energy efficiency, demand response, and renewable energy at a lower price than replacing with new fossil gas. So again, this set of policies does not impact the future and does not change the legal status of those dams. But we do have a confidence that from research from our partners that should a decision be made about the future of those dams that would lead to them being brought down, that would not compromise our ability to achieve 100% clean electricity.
Great. We are then going to pivot to, there's actually one other question that came in on clean electricity that I will address before we move to clean buildings. So for further questions, we're just trying to manage the time here, covering several different policies. So there was just a question about what about then the gas plants in Tacoma, Kalama, kind of other places that we see as far as coming up with, proposed infrastructure, and if that is something you could address.
So the policy is focused on the electric sector, and a key point of the 100% clean policy is to make sure that our electricity system transitions off of coal. It relies on renewable energy rather than gas. But the policy does not specifically address any of the current projects like the LNG facility or the methanol proposal in Kalama. This policy, the 100% clean electricity policy, isn't the last policy we need to address the fossil fuel use in our economy, but as Kelly was talking about, it builds us the bedrock, the foundation stone upon which we can decarbonize, we can reduce greenhouse gas pollution in the rest of the economy and the rest of the ways we rely on it.
Great, thank you. I'm just going through some of these next questions that came in on clean buildings. We went through that. Folks, can tune again to the governor's event that happened at TVW this past Monday, where he also walked through that key priority, and Vlad talked about it. One of the questions that came in, Vlad, when you were mentioning clean buildings priority is what's the plan then to fund existing building rehab?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the most important thing to remember is that energy efficiency saves money. Energy efficiency has a negative cost, which means when building owners, when renters and tenants invest in energy efficiency, they get paid by reducing their energy, their electricity, and fossil gas bills. So ultimately, most of the kind of requirements under this bill will pay for themselves. And that's kind of a key point. That doesn't mean that there aren't barriers to entry, things that we need to overcome to make it easier and to accelerate building retrofits and things like that. But it's really important that how will this be funded? It'll be funded by energy savings that the building owners themselves will enjoy. In order to stimulate quicker, faster action, the clean buildings set of proposals includes a number of funding vehicles that will kind of support early action. That includes incentives for the largest commercial buildings to undertake that action sooner. They can do that as tenants leave and are replaced. They, generally speaking, commercial building owners kind of do retrofits and things like that on existing offices when that happens, and this will kind of enable them to do that quicker. And in addition, the proposal will include money in the capital budget and elsewhere for investments in the public building sector to retrofit and upgrade our existing public building stock to reduce the energy uses in those sectors as well. So the point of the funding is to accelerate and make faster the retrofits, but ultimately energy efficiency is something that pays for itself, and that's sort of a key reason to do it. As I was talking about, a clean energy transition will reduce household and business spending on energy, and that is true of these proposals just as it is of the entire economy.
Okay, thank you. One other question that came in, and then we'll take the last set of questions on the clean fuel standard. There was also then a question about just looking at the life cycle of, you have energy savings that happen within the building retrofits, but then you also need to take into account the materials, the construction, as far as then that overall life cycle with the carbon with clean buildings. So I don't know if you could address that within the policy.
Yeah, that's a very important point. This policy doesn't include, at this point, to my knowledge, components that address that kind of embedded carbon within the building materials, but I do think that's a critical effort that we need to be looking toward. Last session, the legislature passed, I want to say, a budget proviso to kind of create a set of recommendations and drive better analysis around that question. I'm not sure if there will be, it was pointed broadly, the set of policies is pointed to a thing called Buy Clean. And I don't know if there will be a Buy Clean proposal this legislative session, but we can expect it to come back in future sessions for sure to make sure that we are considering not just the amount of energy we're using in buildings, but the amount of energy it took to make the steel that we put in buildings, the concrete that we put in buildings, and other building materials as well. So that's potentially, there could be action on that this year, but it is certainly on the long-term agenda either way.
Great, thank you. And then there's one other question in this regard that actually would be good to take. I'm just trying to take the ones related to this policy. Another question came in is, why does it take 11 years to prohibit new commercial buildings from installing fracked gas for heating? Shouldn't new construction be all electric to start right away? Why wait until 2030?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways we frequently think about the ways we need to act quickly and do things right away. And ultimately, conversations like that are really important. Several cities have taken steps and changed their building codes that essentially achieve those goals. When these codes are updated and adopted, I think what we'll see is, again, early uptake of local governments adopting these standards, and that will push down the amount of fossil gas we're using in these sectors and increase the amount of electricity that we're using instead. And so I think that we'll see a lot of what the question asker was talking about. But providing a runway to allow existing buildings to retrofit, to make investments in retrofits is really important. Creating standards that can be adopted in the areas of the state where we have higher concentrations of new buildings in the Puget Sound region, in Spokane, and Wenatchee, et cetera, is really important. So creating that power for local government to be able to achieve that purpose in some of the densest and highest construction parts of the state is a key component of this bill.
I'm going to move I know there are a lot more questions, and it's fantastic to see the interest and appetite for digging into this, so greatly appreciated. And we can continue to field questions after this event has ended, because we recognize people want to learn a lot about these issues, which is awesome. A question, I'm going to pivot to clean fuels for a few of them. One is just, what is a low carbon biofuel? So an example of one that we're talking about wanting to see more scaled along the West Coast would be great to hear about briefly.
Sure. So just to kind of unpack a little bit of how we calculate that concept. Kelly talked about the low carbon fuels, clean biofuels, sustainable biofuels coming on the basis of a life cycle analysis, and that's the clean fuel standard requires. So it requires the state and fuel providers to look at the full impact of producing the fuel, not just what comes out of the tailpipe, but all the emissions that come, as you sort of talked about in the built space, all the emissions that come that are associated with creating that fuel in the first place. That includes things like land use change. That includes whether or not the fuel was, the feedstock for the fuel came from a food crop, for example, or it was a waste product essentially from an existing planting, or if it was planted for that purpose. All of which is to say the policy is intended The policy is intended to prioritize the cleanest biofuels that come from waste streams, from ag waste, forestry waste, from dairy waste, and things like that. And so what that means is that in California, for example, where this program started in 2011, there are renewable fuels, renewable natural gas that comes from dairies that has a negative carbon score, meaning using it is essentially removing carbon from the atmosphere because of the sort of emissions that we would have expected without the policy. There is a proposal for a new biofuel renewable diesel facility in Ferndale, Washington, that would create renewable diesel from used cooking oil. So whenever you get fries, those fries are deep fried in some kind of delicious vegetable oil that right now we essentially treat as waste. We can take that used cooking oil, we can repurpose it into a renewable diesel product that reduces the total life cycle emissions of transportation by a very significant margin. We have a clean biodiesel facility in Hoquiam, Washington, so supporting rural jobs across the state in Ferndale and Hoquiam and places like that, that relies on feedstocks, again, from agricultural waste, from food industry waste, and similar places. And so this is really important. Both of these facilities that I mentioned, the Hoquiam facility and the proposed Ferndale facility, we produce in Washington a significant amount of biofuels, clean, sustainable, low carbon biofuels. We don't get to consume almost any of them. They all leave the state to places like Oregon and California and British Columbia, places that have clean fuel standards. And so while we received some of the economic benefit of those programs, we did not receive the air quality and public health benefits from them. And so bringing the clean fuel standard here makes sure that we're not only producers of these fuels, supporting the job creation that the program will yield, but that we're also beneficiaries in terms of cleaner air, healthier people, and longer lives.
One of the questions that's come in from a couple of folks, people might have also read the article about palm oil in the New York Times recently, and there's other questions as far as like environmental degradation, greenhouse gas productions around other, biofuels production. And so just want to lift that up again to address that concern, because that's often, brought up when people start talking about these alternatives and what about that. And I think it'd be good to just reconfirm that answer within the policy again.
Absolutely.
I mean, on the questions from folks.
Yeah, there's no question that not every biofuel is a good thing. Just because it's a biofuel doesn't mean we should be using it. Doesn't mean we should be cutting down rainforests, palm forests in South America to produce palm oil and fuels from it. Doesn't mean that we should be converting agricultural food production to energy crops, that we certainly shouldn't be cutting down forests and replacing them with energy crops either. And so the clean fuel standard, the reason we like it is that unlike some existing federal, for example, biofuel mandates, it differentiates between those. It doesn't just say bring your biofuel, doesn't matter where it comes from, but it says we're only going to reward and create a value for the really good stuff. So palm oil, for example, has a higher carbon footprint than fossil fuel-based gasoline, and so it would be penalized and would not be economically viable in Washington. It's already banned under our renewable fuel standard, important to note, but certainly would not be able to come in as a result of this policy either. Biofuels that are generated as a result of forest conversion or food conversion, things like that, would do very poorly under the program. So instead, it would be prioritizing repurposing waste streams, the waste streams that we're already producing, and using them for a productive, low-carbon purpose.
Somebody else asked about also what are about EV incentives might be within the standard and also overall with sessions, I think is, more generally maybe the inquiry.
That's a great question. So the low-carbon fuel standard, as it's called in California, their version of what we will one day have as a clean fuel standard, everyone should knock on wood, creates revenue for utilities that they then are able to return to customers that have electric vehicles. So what that has meant in California is that utilities like PG&E, SDG&E, the very large kind of utilities that California has, have been using the program there, the Clean Fuel Standard, to fund incentives paid for by the program from the utility to customers, equal to about $500 to $600 per new electric car. What we've seen in California is that transit agencies that purchase electric buses are generating $9,000 per bus per year, enabling them to more easily afford clean transportation and spreading the benefits of air quality and clean fuels to everybody. We will, as I kind of mentioned at the top, there are a range of other clean energy policies that beyond these kind of the big three that we've mentioned, and one of them includes an electric vehicle incentive and a program called Charge Ahead that will prioritize low-income access to clean mobility. And we will support our partners in the community to increase access to transit and non-single occupancy driving as well.
Great. Thank you. We have time for just a couple of more questions, so I just want to be mindful with it. One of the questions that came in, which is relevant for actually for all of the policies, is could you touch on how these policies will impact, potentially benefit, impact can be defined in different ways, but rural communities across Washington?
Yeah, absolutely. So in just I'd say a myriad of ways, you know, what we have seen is that renewable energy deployment across the state of Washington has created new revenue streams for farmers, for example, to lease their lands on a willing seller basis. No one is compelled to do anything, but they can partner with renewable energy developers to create an additional revenue stream for hosting wind farms, wind turbines, and solar farms. And we've seen in other parts of the country where you have significant investment and significant growth of renewable energy, like North Carolina, where there's significant investment in solar power. Those landowners, those agricultural and rural landowners, really benefiting from a stable, consistent, long-term source of income that allows farms to stay in production, support family farming, and other benefits. Clean fuel standard, as I was talking about, you know, all of the majority, I should say, of the biofuels that will be sourced will be coming from from rural economy, from waste produced by the rural economy. So agricultural waste right now, dairy waste, manure, and things like that. These are cost drivers for operations that support rural economic vitality. The clean fuel standard will enable these cost drivers, these obligations that exist under law and that farmers and dairy owners have to comply with. They will turn those obligations and cost drivers into revenue generators because those fuels, those wastes, can be turned into fuels. As I was mentioning with the clean fuel standard, Hoquiam already has a biodiesel refinery, a biodiesel production facility. There's a proposal for a new Ferndale facility that is explicitly intended to create fuels for the low carbon fuel standard market in California, the clean fuel standard in Oregon, and the similar program in British Columbia, and eventually a Washington program as well. So this is really supporting the kind of infrastructure build out and support across Washington, not just for urban communities. You know, when the state evaluated the impacts of a clean fuel, the potential impacts of a clean fuel standard in Washington, they found that depending on the pathway to compliance, they could be creating as many as 16,000 jobs on an annual basis to support a clean fuel transition. And those jobs are across each part of Washington's economy, again, in particular supporting rural manufacturing, rural dairies, and rural agriculture as well.
Great, thank you. I am aware that we are at 12:30 and we want to be mindful and respectful of everyone's time. We said this would be a full hour. I know that there are a lot of questions. I've actually noted a lot of them from the chat and folks' names if you've provided them as far as ways we could follow up, because we very much so know that people want the additional questions answered we just couldn't get to today. Really appreciate and want to lift up what Joelle Robinson, our field director, just highlighted. And so in the wrap up, we'll just turn it back to Vlad to send us off for today on this day of climate action and Paris anniversary.
It's a day of climate action followed by 5 months of climate action. We need, like all of us here, we know how committed the folks on the phone are to moving aggressively in a forward direction. Our Washington legislature has prioritized, as publicly said, many legislators, our governor has said that climate action is a priority, which is great, but we can't just assume that because there have been public commitments that the job will get done. So it's really important, again, to highlight again what Joelle was talking about. The slide is still on the screen. Call the hotline, 800-562-6000, to urge your legislators to support 100% clean fuel standard and the Clean Buildings Bill. Tweet to #WowLedge, asking them to pass those bills. Do it now. While listening to Kimberly's questions, I checked on Twitter. People have been doing it, and I would like to see more tweets over the course of this day urging action. Follow the Climate Solutions page, our Facebook and Twitter pages for opportunities to amplify the anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And, you know, write letters to your editor, commit to coming to Lobby Day to lobby on a climate agenda, and follow Climate Solutions and Audubon for our action alerts and the work that we'll do over the coming months in partnership with you. Thanks so much again, everybody, for joining this call. We're going to have an exciting several months, and hopefully at the end of it, we'll be able to celebrate getting some great, ambitious, important, effective stuff done.
Thank you.